I stood at the entrance of Rose Garden Hall while chandeliers laid a warm shine over faces that wanted a simple night, the kind of night where toasts come easy and no one keeps secrets under silk. Violins drifted like a careful breeze. I could taste sugar on the air and something sharper beneath it, the same uneasy taste you get when a smile holds a story it will not tell. Lydia turned beneath the lights in a white dress that drank every camera flash. The room gasped the way people do when they want to believe in a picture. My throat tightened because I knew that neckline. I had seen it once in my mother's closet on a winter afternoon, while she held fabric to her shoulder and laughed at herself in the mirror. I remember thinking how soft joy can be when it has a home. Tonight, joy felt rented. My heels touched the edge of the carpet and would not move. Names traveled table to table. Evelyn, you made it. Evelyn, you look lovely. I nodded like a woman who believed small talk could steady the ground. My husband David slipped beside me with the quiet focus that always makes me breathe deeper. He did not ask if I was ready. He tucked a small recorder into the pocket of my dress and rested his hand over mine for one slow count. I felt the weight of the device against my hip like a second pulse. He leaned closer. "Only if you choose," he said. The violins lifted. Laughter broke across the hall. Someone clinked a glass and called for a speech. Marcus stood near the stage with his hand at the small of my sister's back. He wore a suit that asked to be admired. There was a shine to him I could never trust. He must have felt me watching because he turned and smiled like an ad. Pride has a face. It looks smooth from far away. Up close you can see the strain at the corners. I kept my breath even. I looked at my sister and tried to find the girl who once crawled into my bed when thunder shook the windows. I searched her face the way you search a crowded room for a lost earring. All I found was a version of her that understood an audience better than she understood love. She raised her glass for the photographer, and the crowd answered with a gleam that belonged to glass more than to people. In the corner, Reverend Miles adjusted the microphone. He cleared his throat, and the room settled as if his voice were a church bell. "Let us toast to family unity," he said, warm and plain, the kind of line that should have felt like a quilt over our shoulders. Unity. The word bumped against me like a stranger at a doorway. I did not flinch. I let the word pass through and leave a mark. Under the table of the head row, a stack of wrapped gifts glimmered edges, crisp bows, perfect, the kind of perfection that only matters in pictures. I thought of another table months before that held pill bottles and a chipped mug and a tiny notebook where my mother wrote small hopes in careful ink. A person is a house of details. If you steal the details, you steal the person. A pair of cousins brushed past me with plates. Did you see her ring? Did you see her shoes? I saw my sister's hand sweep over the skirt of her dress. She placed herself at the center of every laugh as if joy were a spotlight, and she owned the switch. I felt the recorder against my hip again. It felt like a promise. It felt like a door. My mouth was dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. I thought of a different dinner and a different table, and a manila envelope peeled open like a bad idea. I heard again the line that had cut right through the softest part of me. Just sign. It is fair. The violin slid down into something sweet. Lydia looked toward me as if she could sense a change in the air, as if the room itself had tilted a little to one side. Her smile stayed perfect. Her eyes did not. I stepped forward. Shoes on carpet slow the patient sound a metronome makes when it keeps a promise. I reached the head row. Lydia raised her glass higher. "To family," she said, and to my sister, who always supports me. The crowd hummed its approval. It sounded like a tide without intention. I leaned toward the microphone. "Let's redefine that word I said." My voice did not need to be loud. It only needed to be clear. The hall quieted the way a field quiets before rain. The recorder felt steady against my side. I could feel every beat of my heart, and none of them were afraid. Lydia tilted her head as if to say, "What now?" I looked at her ring, at the clean line of her eyeliner, at the practiced poise of a woman who knows where the cameras live. Then I looked past her, to the Reverend, to the guests who had come for a celebration to the table of gifts that glittered like a promise made to the wrong person. "You wanted $60,000 for your dream wedding," I said. The words did not shake. "Then let us make this night unforgettable." The last violin note lingered, as if even the music understood a threshold when it hears one. I drew a breath that tasted like a storm about to break and let the story turn backward the way stories do when the ending depends on the beginning. The rain had started before noon, a fine gray curtain that hung over Portland like a held breath. I had been at my desk since morning balancing columns of numbers for a client who believed retirement plans could fix loneliness. The house was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the rhythmic patter of water against the window. When the phone rang, I almost ignored it. The screen lit up with Lydia's name. My sister rarely called unless something had gone wrong or gone viral. I answered anyway. Her voice was syrup, the practice kind she used with strangers who might do her a favor. "Dinner for your birthday," she said. "Just us." The last time she had called me with that tone, it ended with a request to cover her rent and a promise she forgot before the month ended. Still, habit made me polite. "Sure," I said. "That sounds nice." She exhaled like a weight had lifted. "You deserve something special, Evie. You've been working too hard." The nickname hit me in the chest. No one had called me that since our mother. For a moment, it softened me. Then in the background, a man's voice slipped through the line, low and impatient. "Marcus, stop counting," she said yes. My stomach tightened before my mind caught up. What was he counting? Dollars, guests, lawyers. The call ended with her usual rush. "Love you," she said quickly. And the line went silent before I could answer. I stared at the phone until my reflection dimmed in the screen. The rain had grown heavier, tapping the window like a question I did not want to hear. David came in from the porch, shaking off his jacket. He looked at my face and frowned. "Lydia," he guessed. "Birthday dinner," I said. "Just us." He raised an eyebrow. That phrase never meant just us when it came from her. I turned back to my desk, pretending to finish my work, but my mind kept circling the sound of that voice in the background. Marcus counting. Counting what? I opened my laptop to clear my inbox and noticed a new message marked as shared. It was from Lydia. Subject line trust, document template. I clicked it before I could stop myself. The attachment opened to a blank legal form labeled Revocable Living Trust with placeholders for names and property values. I closed the window fast enough to hear my heartbeat in my ears. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she had been planning something with Marcus and had hit the wrong address. But the part of me that had signed too many checks for her emergencies knew better. David leaned over my shoulder. "You saw what I saw, right? She is planning something legal." He said the word legal like it tasted bitter. I nodded and shut the laptop. "And maybe it is nothing," I said, trying to sound steady. "She wants to talk about Mom's house." The words came out before I meant them to. He studied me, waiting for me to finish the thought. I remembered the last argument after the funeral when Lydia had walked through the house pointing at furniture like it was a catalog. Mom would want us to share, she had said, eyes shining with the entitlement of someone who had shown up late and left early. She had taken a silver bracelet and a box of photographs. I had let her. It was easier than fighting grief and greed at the same time. Now the idea of dinner felt like a test I had already failed once. The clock ticked toward 5. The rain slowed a pause between storms. I closed the blinds, trying to calm the unease that had started to grow in my chest. The phone buzzed again, a text from Lydia. "Can you send me Mom's property appraisal? Marcus wants to compare it for fun." I read the line twice. For fun. I did not reply. I went to the kitchen, poured tea, and sat by the window. The yard was slick and empty, the lavender plants bare after winter. They would bloom again soon. My mother had loved watching them come back, proof that some things survive neglect. Clara from next door knocked lightly on the glass. She was holding an umbrella in one hand and a pie tin in the other. The smell of apples filled the space when I opened the door. "Rain's supposed to stop by tomorrow," she said. "You holding up?" She glanced at the papers on my counter. "Still doing the numbers. Always." I smiled. She hesitated before speaking again. "I ran into Lydia at the market last week. She was saying something about inheriting your mother's house soon. Said it like it was already written down somewhere." The words fell into the room like stones. My mouth formed a small, tired smile. Lydia has dreams. Clara shook her head. "Just be careful, honey. Families get strange when money wears a familiar face." After she left, I carried the pie to the table and sat for a long time without tasting it. The rain eased, leaving a shine on the streetlights. I looked at the photo on the wall, Mom in her garden holding two little girls with the same eyes and different futures. I whispered to her picture, "I know you wanted peace. I do too. I just don't know if she understands what peace costs." My phone buzzed again. A new message from Lydia. "Can you wear something nice tomorrow?" "Marcus booked a table at Amalfi's. He wants to meet you properly." The message ended with a heart emoji. I typed back a single word, "Sure," then deleted it. I closed the phone and sat in the quiet. David called from the other room. "Everything all right?" "It is just dinner," I said. No drama this time. The lie settled easy on my tongue. Outside, the rain began again, gentle but steady, like the world trying to remind me that nothing ever dries completely. The fog hung low that morning, a thick white breath over the small street where my mother's house sat. The porch wood was still damp from rain, and when I turned the key, the familiar creak greeted me like an old ache. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. It had been months since I came here. I told myself I was only checking the pipes and sorting mail, but the truth was simpler. I missed the sound of her. I walked through each room, slowly letting the silence press against me. In the living room, the wallpaper had faded to the color of old paper, and along the hallway the pencil marks were still there each year, measured with a date and two names. Evelyn, 10. Lydia, 6. I ran my fingers over them and felt the grooves where the pencil had dug into plaster. Mom never painted over it. She said it was our family tree written by hand. I stood there longer than I should have until the quiet began to sting. The kitchen held the same faint smell of coffee and lemon cleaner. Her teacup still sat near the window, a circle of dust marking its absence of use. I began wiping surfaces not to clean but to feel busy. The cloth darkened with gray as I moved across counters and picture frames. That was when I noticed the flowers. On the small table near her framed photo was a bouquet, bright pink and impossibly shiny. The petals were plastic, the stems too stiff. A tag still hung from one of them, the kind used at discount stores. Dollar Tree. I leaned closer. A note was tucked between the stems, written in Lydia's looping script. "Sorry, couldn't make it. Had content shoot L." The handwriting looked rushed, as if written while waiting for something to upload. I held the note for a moment, the air in the room thinning around me. Plastic flowers, a content shoot. My mother had raised us to bring real flowers even to strangers' graves. I sat down, slowly feeling the hollowness in my chest spread. The click of my phone pulling me back to the present startled me. An email from the utility company confirmed that the automatic payments for this house were still drawing from Mom's old account. I opened the bank portal to check the balance. There were a few small withdrawals from the final month. Groceries, hospice care, pharmacy. Then one that did not belong. Venmo to Lydia Harper, $250. Memo line read for your nails before the shoot. My eyes blurred for a second. I read it again to be sure. Mom was paying her to look perfect while dying. I said it aloud without meaning to my voice, small and hoarse. The sound of those words made the house colder. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms together, fighting the sting behind my eyes. My mother had worked double shifts for decades, sewing in the back room of a boutique that never remembered her birthday. She paid every bill herself until her hands trembled too much to hold a pen, and still she found money for Lydia's nails. The fog outside pressed against the windows. I stood and walked to her bedroom. The air there felt untouched. On the dresser sat her old wallet, brown leather with the corner worn smooth. I opened it carefully. Inside were folded receipts from the hospital ink fading to blue. Tucked among them was a small note written in her neat cursive. "Tell Evelyn not to take all the burden." I traced the line with my thumb until it blurred. She must have written it while I was at work when she thought I could still be spared the weight. The note shook slightly in my hands. I wanted to believe she meant emotional burden, but deep down I knew she also meant Lydia. I slipped the note back into the wallet and turned toward the closet. The door stuck for a moment before giving way. Inside hung rows of her clothes, faint with the smell of lavender soap. One sleeve brushed my arm as I reached for the top shelf. A box slid forward, spilling old photos onto the floor. I knelt, gathering them up. Mom holding us at the beach. Lydia on her shoulders, both faces turned toward the sun. Another from Christmas me with my first paycheck envelope, Lydia clutching a doll she had begged for. The last one caught my breath. A photo of us as teenagers, arms around each other, both smiling. On the back, written in purple ink, were 2 words, "Sisters Forever." The phrase twisted something inside me. Forever had turned into a countdown. I sat back against the bed frame, the photo trembling slightly between my fingers. The house creaked softly, wood settling as if listening. I looked at the fake bouquet again through the open door, bright and unchanging, and for the first time in months, I wished the flowers were real enough to wilt. The clock on the wall ticked toward noon. My phone buzzed on the table. A new message from Lydia. "Don't forget tomorrow at Amalfi's. Marcus says bring the property papers if you still have them. It'll make conversation easier." A smiling emoji followed. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. My mother's handwriting flashed in my mind again. "Tell Evelyn not to take all the burden." "Too late, Mom," I whispered. The fog outside thickened until the garden disappeared completely. Inside, only the ticking clock kept time, marking the quiet seconds of a house that remembered everything. Amalfi's was the kind of restaurant that pretended to be intimate, while every table was close enough to hear someone's secrets. The air smelled of garlic and expensive wine, the kind meant to impress more than enjoy. Warm light from chandeliers fell over the polished wood, and as I stepped inside, I felt it cling to me, like a disguise. Lydia was already there, sitting at a table near the center. She waved with that same practiced brightness I had seen in her posts, the smile designed to look effortless. It was the dress that stopped me. A deep red silk one fitted at the waist, the same dress I had given our mother for Christmas 15 years ago. Mom had worn it only once to a church concert and then folded it carefully into tissue paper. Lydia smoothed the fabric, now twisting slightly so it caught the light. "Mom would want me to wear this," she said. "It's vintage." My mouth went dry. I could almost hear the soft gasp of every woman over 50 who might watch this moment later. I managed a small nod. She smiled wider, as if approval were a currency. Marcus stood to greet me, extending his hand. His grip was firm and lingered too long. His eyes flickered over me in silent appraisal before the polite smile returned. "Evelyn," he said, "it's such a pleasure to finally meet the sister." His tone stretched that last word until it sounded like a rank instead of a relation. David's hand found my back, steadying me as we sat. A waitress appeared with menus and a too bright smile. Lydia ordered wine before anyone else spoke. When the glasses arrived, she lifted hers. "To family," she said. "To the future." I looked at the glass in my hand and thought of Mom's voice at the hospital, faint but clear. "Take care of each other." The food came quickly, plates steaming, smells of basil and butter filling the space. Lydia laughed loudly, performing ease. Marcus chimed in with short business-like comments about his startup and future investments. I listened, my stomach tight. The evening moved with the precision of something rehearsed. After dessert plates were cleared, Lydia placed a manila envelope on the table, its edges slightly creased. She smiled the way people do when they think generosity will mask intent. Mom always wanted us to share everything, she said softly. Marcus reached for the envelope and slid it toward me. Inside was a stack of papers clipped neatly. The title read, Harper Family Trust. I scanned the first page. It detailed the transfer of my mother's home savings and remaining assets into joint ownership between Lydia Harper and Marcus Reed. The line for witness signatures had been left blank. The signature for E. Harper, however, was already written in blue ink. My stomach dropped. The handwriting looked eerily like mine. David leaned closer, his voice a low whisper. They forged your signature. Lydia pretended not to hear. She adjusted her wine glass and said, We just thought it would make everything smoother. You've handled so much already. This way it's equal. Marcus's smile sharpened. You'll save legal fees if you just cooperate. The word cooperate landed like a slap. I folded the papers slowly, aligning the edges until the sound of the crisp paper filled the silence. Then I placed them back on the table. The candle flame flickered between us, its reflection dancing in the wine. I reached into my purse fingers, brushing the small recorder I had slipped in that morning. I pressed the button gently. The red light blinked once inside the dark leather. David's eyes met mine. His voice was steady. Oregon's a one-party consent state. Marcus frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, a man from the next table stood. He had been quiet through his meal suit jacket draped over his chair. The moment he turned, I recognized him. His name was Phillips, a local attorney I had seen once at the bank. He spoke firmly. It means she doesn't need your permission. We're done here. He dropped a few bills on his table and left without looking back. Lydia's face turned pale, her smile cracking. You can't record family, she said, her voice rising. The restaurant quieted around us. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. I looked at her across the table, at the red dress shining under the light, at the arrogance that used to charm and now only exposed her. Then stop acting like a stranger, I said softly. For a moment, no one moved. Marcus shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. Lydia's hands trembled slightly, the wine glass shaking enough to spill a thin red line across the tablecloth. The sound of it dripping felt louder than any words. The waitress appeared at the edge of the table, hesitant. Is everything okay here? She asked quietly. Lydia forced a laugh. Of course, she said, dabbing at the spill. Just a little misunderstanding. Her voice wavered at the edges. I watched the stain spread dark against the white cloth and thought of blood blooming under snow. The candle flickered again. David leaned back in his chair, eyes cold. Evelyn, he said, maybe we should go. I nodded and stood sliding the recorder deeper into my purse. Lydia tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Marcus reached for her arm, guiding her down. His voice was low, meant only for her. You said she'd sign. I walked away before I could hear her answer. Outside, the night air was cold enough to sting. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, shimmering like false stars. David opened the car door, but I hesitated, looking back through the restaurant window. Lydia sat still at the table, staring down at the empty glass in front of her. The dress looked brighter under the lights, too bright for mourning, too false for victory. As the door closed behind us, I realized the warmth inside had been only a trick of the light. The night after Amalfi's hung in my memory like a photograph that had not quite developed. David and I closed the door and stood in the kitchen while the house settled around us. He set the small recorder on the counter, and the red light blinked once, like a small promise. We sat and he pressed play, and Lydia's voice filled the room bright as if nothing heavy lived in it. Just sign it, Evie, she said softly. You're too old to handle property alone. Hearing her use my name that way felt like a violation of history, as if someone had rewritten the past with a polite pen. Marcus chuckled in the background about saving fees and moving quickly, and the sound made my hands go cold. David stopped the tape and said they pre-signed your name, and the way he said it turned the paper into a weapon. Clara arrived carrying a thermos and sat without fuss and listened to the recording a second time. her mouth a thin line when Lydia said it is fair. You could bury her in silence, Clara said softly, or you could let truth do it for you. Her words landed like a tool placed in my palm, and I believed then that action could be a form of justice. My mother had always said, never let lies grow roots in this house, and the line came back not as a memory, but as instruction. I thought of the months at the hospice when she stitched and hummed, and Lydia stopped by long enough to take a photo and then left again. I thought of the Venmo line that read for your nails before the shoot, and of the plastic flowers at the shrine, and those details together made a pattern I could not ignore. We listened again, and I read the email she had sent and opened the trust template with its neat boxes and the line where E. Harper had been written already in blue ink. If you pre-sign a line, you are trying to make consent look like paper, Clara said, and the phrase struck like a bell. There was a practical side to what we decided. David said quietly, "We will not humiliate, we will reveal," and his voice had the calm steadiness of someone who handles hard things. I called the bank to ask about account movements, and hearing the steps named out loud made the work feel less like accusation and more like process. David rang his sister at the firm and asked hypothetically about pre-signed lines and forgery, and she confirmed that a pre-signed line is a red flag, not the way careful work is done. Her answer settled some of the spinning and made the path ahead clearer, because proof is the only thing that keeps rumor from becoming a story. Clara brewed tea and told me small stories about my mother sewing late into the night and laughing at a radio joke, and in her voice the house became a place that deserved defense rather than a case file. We planned to be calm to let truth do its work, and we set rules: speak only facts, do not accuse. Keep your voice even, do not give them the satisfaction of spectacle. Before bed, I spread copies of the email, the trust template, and the printout of the Venmo payment across the table and underlined the lines that defined the house, the accounts, and the pre-signed name. I wrote a note to myself about one-party consent in Oregon and underlined it the way a woman underlines a sentence in a book so she will not forget the law when she needs it most. The photograph with sisters forever on the back warmed in my hands as I held it, and I told myself I was acting out of care, not cruelty. David held me and said, "Whatever you do it with clarity," and the small kindness steadied my hands. Clara squeezed my elbow before she left, and the squeeze meant she would stand if called upon. I slept in fits and woke early and packed the recorder into a small pouch with 2 fresh batteries and a note that read, "Stay calm, only facts, and fold nothing without showing it first." On the drive into town, the city moved in its ordinary routines, and I felt like a woman carrying a private truth until it was time to make it public. I chose the navy dress my mother had liked because it felt like armor tempered with memory, and because I wanted to show that protecting what was ours did not require spectacle. David checked the batteries again and smiled in a way that looked like relief and resolution, and I tucked the recorder into its place as if tucking a child into bed. We had a list of people who might matter if witnesses became necessary, and a short statement rehearsed until it felt like something true rather than theatrical. We did not want to humiliate. We wanted to present evidence and let the room decide whether a house is a home or an object to be traded. I walked to the back door and pressed my palm to the cold glass facing the lavender bed my mother planted and pictured the roots quiet and patient, under soil waiting for warmth. My voice was soft when I said, "Mom, I will not let her take you too," and the words felt like a promise, not a threat. David came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders and said, "We will do this right," and that steadied me like a light in fog. That morning, I folded the printouts into my bag, feeling the weight of paper like proof and the weight of truth like relief and resolve. 3 weeks passed before the next storm came. I was drinking coffee when Clara called and said, "Check your phone." I opened the link she sent, and there it was, a new video with the title, "Engaged," followed by a row of hearts. Lydia's face filled the frame, lit with perfect lighting and the kind of joy that feels staged. Her hands flashed a diamond that caught the reflection of our mother's old chandelier. The camera pulled back slowly and my breath stopped. The background was unmistakable. It was our mother's living room, the same corner where the memorial photo still stood framed in silver. The candle holder next to it glowed faintly behind Lydia's head. I leaned closer as if the screen would change, but it didn't. The caption read, "From Mom's home to my forever home." My coffee went cold in my hand. The comment section was already full of emojis and congratulations, but one comment cut through the glitter. "That house looks like a ghost lives there." Hundreds of likes followed. I watched Lydia laugh through the awkwardness, pretending not to see it. Then Marcus appeared next to her arm around her waist. He smiled with that same thin confidence I had seen across the dinner table. A small clip from a local online channel followed their post, an engagement feature for social media. When the interviewer asked about the location, Marcus said proudly, "Her family supports our new life." His hand brushed the photo of our mother as if claiming it. My stomach twisted. I saved the clip quietly and whispered, "Not anymore." Clara came by that afternoon carrying her old laptop and 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside me and watched the video without saying a word until the end. "You're not destroying her," she said finally. "You're protecting what's left." Her voice was calm and precise, like someone naming truth instead of giving advice. I replayed the clip once more, slowing it down until the edges blurred. The lavender wallpaper behind Lydia looked faded and bruised in the light. That was the wall Mom had painted herself on a summer weekend when Lydia was 13. I remembered how she stood on a chair while I held the roller tray. Now it was the backdrop for a commercial smile. I closed the laptop and stared at the blank television across the room. The reflection showed me my own face, calm but sharper than before. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder and clearer. David came home from work and I showed him the video. He watched quietly, then asked, "Is this the house or a set?" I said both. He nodded, understanding that some lies use familiarity as camouflage. That evening, I sat at my desk surrounded by documents, copies of the trust draft, the Venmo transfer, and the screenshot of her caption, "From Mom's home to my forever home." The phrasing was deliberate. It sounded like inheritance wrapped in sentiment. Clara wrote down the timeline for me: March dinner, April silence, May engagement. Patterns matter, she said, because courts like sequence more than emotion. I smiled faintly. She was right. I wasn't after punishment. I was after order. The next morning, the video had reached 20,000 views. I scrolled through the comments. Most were strangers celebrating love, but a few recognized the room. One said, "Is that Harper's old house on Maple? I thought it was sold." Another replied, "No, her sister still owns it." The thread exploded beneath them. I didn't comment. I just watched the narrative begin to shift. Lydia uploaded a new story later that afternoon, smiling again, but her eyes looked tight. Marcus stood beside her, pretending ease. Behind them, the memorial photo was gone, replaced by a vase of artificial lilies. I almost laughed at the irony. Plastic flowers again. The day turned gray and rain pressed softly against the windows. I stepped outside to the garden, and the air smelled of wet earth. The lavender my mother had planted was beginning to bloom, pale purple and quiet. I knelt and touched the soil. The house behind me still held the warmth of her voice, the one that said, "Never let lies grow roots here." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace, not because anything was over, but because I knew what came next. Justice wasn't about noise. It was about exposure. Clara stood at the porch watching me and said gently, "You already have the truth. All you need now is the right room for it to echo." I looked back at the house, the faint reflection of the engagement ring still playing on my phone screen, and whispered, "Mom, they tried to turn your home into a backdrop, but I will turn it back into evidence." The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked among bills and charity letters. Lydia's handwriting curled across the envelope in looping silver ink. Inside was a thick ivory card printed with gold embossing, Formal attire only. Theme family unity. I stared at those words until the coffee in my mug went cold. The irony was almost elegant. David read it over my shoulder and said nothing at first. Finally, he murmured, "She really wrote that." I nodded, slipping the card back into its envelope as if it might burn. For 3 days, I left it on the counter beside the fruit bowl. I told myself I would ignore it, but each time I passed by, my eyes caught the words again. Formal attire only, and they sounded less like a request and more like a dare. Clara came by on Sunday afternoon with a grocery bag and her usual calm. She spotted the envelope immediately. "You should go," she said before I even spoke. I shook my head. "I have nothing to prove." She placed the groceries down and looked at me steadily. "Justice doesn't knock twice, Evelyn. When the door opens, you walk through, or you spend the rest of your life wondering, what if?" The phrase stayed in the air long after she left. That night, I sat at my mother's vanity brushing my hair slowly. The mirror reflected the lavender field outside, half in bloom. I thought of how Lydia would arrange her makeup for the cameras, how Marcus would practice his smile. Somewhere deep down, anger stirred, but it wasn't wild anymore. It was measured. The next morning, I opened my closet and paused before the navy dress. My mother had worn that color to every important moment in her life: graduations, funerals, even her last Christmas dinner. I slipped it from the hanger and held it against the light. The fabric caught the morning sun, turning a deep sea blue. "This one," I whispered. She would understand. Clara returned that afternoon with a small box. Inside was a simple pearl brooch that had belonged to my mother. "Pin it where they can see it," she said. "Not as decoration as declaration." I smiled faintly. David joined us later, carrying the recorder and 2 fresh batteries. He set it on the table and pressed play for a test run. The tiny red light blinked to life, and the familiar click of its internal wheel filled the quiet room. 2 hours of truthful battery, he said. The line felt like a ritual. We rehearsed the details of the night quietly over dinner. No raised voice, no accusations. Just play the recording. Let silence do the rest. The strength of truth is in how it unnerves people when they hear their own tone, David said. I nodded. The plan was simple, but the weight of it pressed heavy in my chest. As dusk settled, I walked to the garden. The lavender swayed gently under the cool wind, and the air smelled of rain about to fall. I bent down, brushing my fingers over the petals, and whispered, "I am not doing this to destroy you, Mom. I am doing it because you deserve to rest." Back inside, I stood before the mirror once more. My reflection looked both familiar and foreign. The navy dress fit perfectly the brooch, catching light like a quiet heartbeat. I fastened a silver bracelet David had given me when I turned 40, a reminder of steadiness, not glamour. He stood behind me in the doorway and asked, "You sure?" I met his eyes through the mirror. "Tonight, I am not the caretaker," I said slowly. "I am the witness." He nodded and kissed the top of my head. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirp of night insects outside. I laid out everything on the dresser purse recorder extra batteries invitation. I wrote a short note and left it by the phone in case anything unexpected happened. It simply said, "The truth belongs to no one." Around midnight, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the living room, touching the edges of framed photos, the piano lid, the old clock that still chimed wrong every hour. Each sound grounded me, reminding me this house was built by work, not inheritance. When dawn came, I brewed coffee and watched the lights slide across the floor. For a moment, I imagined what my mother would say. Probably something like, "Be gracious but firm. Do not meet cruelty with chaos." So I dressed with deliberate care and packed the recorder in the inner pocket of my clutch. Outside, the sky was pale gold, the kind of morning that pretends peace before a storm. Clara texted, "Are you ready?" I replied, "Ready enough." David took the driver's seat, his hand resting lightly on mine as we drove. Neither of us spoke much. Portland drifted past the windows, green and damp as ever. My thoughts were clear, stripped of fear, now replaced with a strange calm. As we approached Rose Garden Hall, the sun broke briefly through clouds, scattering light across the windshield. I watched it and whispered quietly, "This time, it's not grief that brings me there. It's closure." David glanced over and smiled slightly. "You look like her," he said, meaning my mother. The comment steadied me more than anything else could. When we parked, I took a long breath, the kind you take before walking into a courtroom or a confession. My phone buzzed once a new message from Lydia. "So glad you're coming, big night for both of us." I stared at it until the words blurred and then deleted it. I stepped out of the car, adjusted the brooch, and looked toward the hall entrance where laughter spilled through the glass doors. Inside somewhere, music was playing something soft and romantic. My heartbeat slowed, not from nerves, but from purpose. Tonight truth would be louder than the music. The Rose Garden Hall shimmered under chandeliers that looked like frozen rain. Tables glowed with crystal glassware and ribbons of pale gold. The sound of string instruments floated above the hum of conversation. I stood near the entrance for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the light and the noise. Lydia and Marcus were at the center of it all, radiant, as if the night existed to orbit them. Reverend Miles moved among the guests, shaking hands, his white collar bright under the soft lighting. Family and old neighbors filled the room, each one smiling in the polite way people do when they are pretending not to remember the past. Clara caught my eye from across the room and gave the smallest nod. David's hand brushed mine once, a silent question, and I answered with a steady breath. We took our seats near the front. Lydia noticed me at last, and her smile widened. "Evelyn, you made it?" She said, her tone sweet and practiced. Marcus leaned forward slightly, as if measuring my composure. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, and my voice sounded calm even to me. The music softened. Marcus took the microphone first, speaking with the easy charm of someone who believes his story is the only one worth hearing. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked Reverend Miles for the blessing, and thanked Lydia for saying yes. Then he said, "I also want to thank her family for supporting everything we do." The line hung in the air, heavy with irony. Lydia stepped beside him, her hand over the microphone. She laughed lightly and lifted her glass. "To family," she said, "to unity, and to my sister, who supports everything I do." Applause rippled through the crowd. I rose from my chair before the sound faded. Every movement felt deliberate, the click of my heels, the rustle of fabric, the calm rhythm of my breath. I reached the small stage and looked at Lydia. "Everything you do, Lydia," I asked softly. "Let's make sure they hear it." Her smile faltered a fraction, but she recovered quickly. "Of course," she said into the microphone, "my sister is always dramatic." A few polite laughs rose from the guests. I took the recorder from my clutch and placed it gently beside the flower arrangement. The red light blinked once. The first voice that filled the room was Lydia's, bright and familiar. "Just sign it, Evie, it's fair." The sound carried over the speakers, pure and unmistakable. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Chairs creaked as people turned. Marcus's voice followed. 10,000 is nothing, don't be selfish." The hall went utterly still. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against a plate, then nothing. Lydia's face drained of color, the smile collapsing piece by piece. Reverend Miles lowered his head slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "The truth doesn't need volume." The recording continued, Lydia again saying, "If you love me, you'll make this easy." David reached to lower the volume, but I stopped him. "Let them hear." The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the building itself was listening. Clara stood at the edge of the room, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she began to clap, once, then twice, and others joined, unsure but compelled. Marcus stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This is absurd," he said, clearly staged. "Evelyn, enough," Lydia snapped. "You're humiliating yourself." I turned to her and said, "I think that line was taken." A ripple of shocked laughter broke through the tension. I walked to the gift table and placed the recorder on top of the wrapped boxes. "That's my gift," I said. No one spoke. Lydia's hand trembled around her champagne flute. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her almost translucent. Marcus reached for the recorder, but Reverend Miles's voice cut through, gentle but firm. "Leave it." He said, "The truth is speaking." Lydia tried to smile again, but her lips barely moved. Guests avoided her eyes, pretending to fix napkins or refill glasses. The band stopped playing altogether. A woman from our old neighborhood whispered, "I remember that house. Her mother worked so hard for it." The words spread like quiet wildfire. I stepped back from the table, letting the room take in what it had heard. My mother's photo from the video flashed in my mind, and I felt something release deep in my chest. Not joy, not anger, just air that had been trapped too long. Marcus turned toward me, his voice low enough for only a few to hear. "You'll regret this?" I met his gaze steady. "Maybe, but I'll regret silence more." Lydia's eyes glistened as she looked at me. "Why would you do this to me?" she whispered. I answered evenly, "You did it to yourself. I just pressed play." Reverend Miles lifted his glass slowly. "To truth," he said quietly. The room hesitated, then followed. To truth, the words uneven but sincere. Lydia lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. Marcus backed away, scanning for someone to rescue the moment, but no one moved. The guests began to disperse quietly, some slipping out, already texting others, shaking their heads. David came to my side and touched my arm. "It's done," he said softly. I nodded, my throat tight. Clara approached, handing me my clutch. Her eyes were bright, not with victory, but with relief. "You didn't destroy her," she said. "You just turned the lights on." I looked once more at the stage, at the pale gold decorations, and the untouched cake gleaming under spotlights. For a moment, I almost pitied her standing there among the ruins of her own performance. Almost. I walked toward the door, hearing the first murmur of conversations restarting behind me. Someone asked if the recording was real. Another said, "I always knew something was off about that girl." The night air hit my face, cool and sharp. Outside the hall, the sound of laughter began again, but smaller, more uncertain. David opened the car door, and I paused, looking back through the glass doors where Lydia still stood, frozen under the chandeliers. The reflection of the recorder light blinked faintly against her dress like a heartbeat she could not silence. I whispered to myself, "That's enough noise," and turned away as the door closed softly behind us. By morning, the city already knew. Portland had a way of carrying stories like pollen floating through the damp air until they settled everywhere. The engagement video disappeared from Lydia's profile, but a dozen screen recordings replaced it. Headlines on small gossip blogs read, "Family Feud at Rose Garden Hall." The clip of her voice saying, "Just sign it." Evie was shared with disbelief and amusement. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and the faint hum of rain against the window. David was reading his phone across from me, his expression quiet but edged with disbelief. Marcus lost his position. He said finally the firm posted a statement early this morning. Conflict of interest and breach of professional ethics. I stirred my tea, slowly watching the small swirl of steam rise. Lydia's sponsors started pulling out. He continued her skincare deal. Gone. The jewelry one, too. I said nothing. The kettle clicked off behind me like punctuation. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Clara came by mid-morning with her tablet in hand. She sat opposite me, scrolling through the endless comments. "It spread faster than wildfire," she said. Then she looked up, meeting my eyes. "Are you all right?" I nodded, though the question felt heavier than it sounded. I wasn't happy exactly. Happiness didn't fit this kind of silence. It was more like gravity had returned after a long time of floating. Clara turned the tablet so I could read one particular comment pinned under a reposted video. "You don't use your mother's death for content." The words glowed against the white background, thousands of likes beneath it. That was the line that stopped me, not because it hurt, but because it told me people still recognize decency when they saw it violated. Clara placed the tablet down quietly. Sometimes justice is simply seeing the world agree with you. I exhaled slowly. That's enough noise, I said. She smiled faintly. Good, she whispered, because silence suits truth better than applause. In the afternoon, David stepped out to buy groceries, and I found myself wandering the house absent-mindedly, touching the edges of framed photos and the cool glass of the front window. Outside, the lavender garden bent in the breeze, heavy with rainwater. Each flower seemed to bow under the weight, but none broke. I thought of my mother again, of the way she used to hum when she worked, and how she believed goodness always found its way back, even if it took time. On the television, a news segment replayed still photographs from the party. The reporter's voice was polite neutral, but the captions were not. Attorney Marcus Hale resigns, following leaked recording. Influencer Lydia Harper deactivates social media after viral exposure. It was strange hearing our names spoken like headlines when for years we were just two sisters from Maple Avenue. I muted the screen and turned it toward the wall. Clara brewed a second pot of tea, humming under her breath. She told me a few of the neighbors had called saying they were proud that someone finally stood up to the endless entitlement that had begun to feel normal. I didn't know how to respond. Pride felt misplaced in a story built on grief. Near evening, David returned carrying paper bags. He set them down and said softly, "She called me. Lydia." My heart didn't jump. It simply settled lower. What did she want? He shrugged. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a line back to normal. I didn't answer. I poured more tea instead. The house smelled of chamomile and rain. At 7, the phone rang again, but I let it go to voicemail. Clara squeezed my shoulder before leaving. "The truth's done its work," she said. "Let the silence do the rest." When the door closed behind her, I stood for a long time watching the dimming sky. The lavender reflected against the window like faint purple ghosts. The city was moving on, but I stayed still because stillness felt like the only honest way to end a storm. Somewhere down the street, a car horn echoed, and then quiet returned. I set the empty teacup in the sink and leaned against the counter. The air was cool, the kind that fills lungs without burning. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. There was only space. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes. That night before bed, I opened my laptop once more. The comment was still there, pinned beneath the viral clip. "You don't use your mother's death for content." I typed a reply, but erased it before sending. It didn't need my voice. The truth was standing fine on its own. I closed the computer and whispered again to no one in particular, "That's enough noise." A month passed before her name appeared on my phone again. The screen lit up while I was pruning the lavender, and for a moment I just watched it ring. Lydia. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something quiet in me said answer. Her voice was small, breathy. "Evelyn, please. Just until I get back on my feet." The background sounded like traffic, maybe a bus stop. I didn't say anything. My silence made her rush faster. "I just need a place to stay for a week. You know I'd do the same for you." I closed my eyes and saw her in that red dress, the one that belonged to our mother, laughing in the restaurant while holding a forged document. I remembered the plastic bouquet on the memorial table. She waited for me to speak. The rain had started again, faint against the kitchen window. I said, "Finally, Lydia, what exactly are you asking for?" She exhaled shakily. "Just a little help." Everyone turned their back on me. Marcus left. The comments never stop. I can't sleep. I leaned on the counter, letting her words fall into the space between us. When people are stripped of their audience, they finally look for witnesses. "Evelyn, please," she said again. "You're all I have." I almost laughed, but it wasn't amusement, just disbelief. "Lydia, you had everyone she once had. You traded them for applause." She started to cry, the sound messy and unguarded. "You're cruel," she gasped. "Cruel?" I took a breath before answering. Cruelty is expecting love without accountability. She sobbed harder, maybe out of shame, maybe because no one had spoken to her that plainly in a long time. I walked to the window. The lavender bent under the wind like 1,000 small nods. The world outside looked clean washed. Lydia said, "At least help me find a lawyer." My voice stayed calm. "You already had 3. There was a pause so long I could hear her breathing shift from pleading to anger. She whispered something I couldn't catch a sound between apology and insult. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a while, not surprised. David came in carrying groceries. "She called," he asked quietly. I nodded. What did she want? The same thing she always wanted. The easy way out. He set the bags down and looked at me for a moment. "Did you give it to her?" "No," I said. "Not this time." I poured water into the kettle and watched the steam rise. My hands were steady. Outside, the sky had begun to clear the kind of gray that looks silver before sunset. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not even relief, just an unmistakable stillness, the kind that arrives when boundaries finally hold. The phone buzzed again, later a text this time. It said simply, "Sorry." Another message followed. I didn't know what I was doing. I read both and put the phone face down on the table. Some apologies are just new attempts at entry. Clara called that evening to check in. I told her briefly about the call. She said, "You did right. A clean no is kinder than a dishonest yes." We talked for a few minutes about her garden, her neighbor, small things that reminded me life had texture outside of pain. Before hanging up, she said softly, "Sometimes clarity is the real form of forgiveness." That line stayed with me after she hung up. I sat at the table long after dark, the sound of rain fading, the lavender scent faint in the air. Lydia didn't call again that night. I imagined her somewhere in a small apartment scrolling through what was left of her digital life, still trying to edit the truth. But this wasn't a story she could crop or caption. It was already written, already heard. When I finally went to bed, the house was quiet. David's breathing beside me, steady the way it always was when he knew I'd made a hard choice. I whispered into the dark, not to anyone, but as a reminder. Peace isn't something you win. It's what's left when you stop negotiating with pain. The June air carried a calm warmth that felt unfamiliar after so many months of tension. I spent my mornings in the backyard, kneeling in the soil, planting rows of lavender where my mother's garden used to bloom. The scent rose softly around me, clean and quiet like forgiveness that didn't need to be spoken. The old fence was chipped in places, but I left some of the worn wood untouched because it felt honest. Clara arrived with a paint tray and a soft laugh saying, "You can't heal in a house that still looks like a battlefield." She wore overalls splattered with pale blue paint and handed me a brush. Together we worked through the afternoon repainting the walls of the porch. When we paused for water, she looked at me and said, "You turned grief into a boundary, Evelyn." Her words settled in my chest, deeper than she probably intended. I looked at the garden and thought, maybe that's what boundaries are, flowers planted where hurt used to grow. As the light faded, I went inside, washed my hands, and sat at the desk by the window. The same desk that once held bills and legal papers now held only a small lamp and my laptop. For weeks I had been drafting ideas in my head, but tonight I started to type for real. The title came first. Boundaries don't destroy families, they define them. The first sentence followed almost on its own. When love becomes a debt, it stops being love. My hands moved slowly, steady. I wrote about my mother, about responsibility, about the quiet lesson of saying no, and meaning it. Every word felt like a brick in something new, a house not of walls but of clarity. David passed by the doorway, pausing to watch me type. "You look lighter," he said. I smiled. Maybe that's what happens when you stop carrying someone else's chaos. He nodded and went to make tea, leaving me with the soft sound of the kettle. Later that week, a small package arrived on the doorstep, wrapped in brown paper with no return label. Inside was a wooden frame, simple, polished, smooth. It held a black and white photograph of my mother standing in front of her old garden, smiling at the camera. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 5 words: "Peace is the new wealth. Reverend Miles." I placed the frame on the windowsill facing the lavender so she could see her flowers bloom again. That night, I sat outside on the porch with Clara. The air smelled of fresh paint and summer rain. She asked if I missed Lydia. I didn't lie. Sometimes I said, but missing someone doesn't mean you invite the storm back in. She nodded quietly. The sky dimmed from orange to violet. Fireflies appeared among the lavender like brief forgivenesses, lighting up and vanishing again. Inside the house, the clock ticked softly, a reminder that time was still moving forward, even when memory tried to hold it still. When I closed the laptop later, the page glowed faintly on the screen, waiting for more stories. Maybe I'd write about boundaries again, or maybe about peace. I turned off the lamp and whispered into the dim room. "Mom, I think you'd like it here now." The silence that followed felt whole, not empty. The end of summer in Portland carried that faint sweetness of ripe fruit and warm dust that clung to the air. The Saturday market stretched across the square with stalls lined in bright colors. I walked slowly between them, holding a small canvas bag filled with peaches and bread. The world felt ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. Vendors called out soft greetings. Children chased each other through the crowd. I hadn't realized until that morning how long it had been since I had moved through a place without scanning for danger or shame. Near the flower stand, a woman waved at me. She was one of my mother's old friends from church, gray hair pulled back neatly, a kindness still visible in her eyes. "Evelyn," she said, "I heard what happened." For a second, I braced myself for judgment, but her voice carried only calm admiration. "You did the right thing." I smiled, small and real. "I didn't want revenge," I said. "I wanted peace." She nodded once, as if she had been waiting for that answer. "Sometimes that's the hardest kind of justice," she replied. She handed me a stem of lavender from her own basket and walked away, leaving its scent in my hand. I kept moving through the market, buying small things for no reason. Tomatoes, I didn't need a jar of honey for the color. The ordinary rhythm of people living their lives hummed around me. At the edge of the crowd, I saw 2 sisters, maybe 8 and 10 the younger, holding tight to the older's hand. The smaller one looked up with the same wide, unguarded trust Lydia once had before life, and greed rewrote her face. The older girl leaned down to whisper something that made the younger laugh. That sound caught me off guard, bright and uncomplicated. I stood there a moment watching them until they disappeared into the line for lemonade. I whispered quietly to myself, "I hope she keeps her kindness." The words drifted away, but they felt like a small prayer. When I returned home, the afternoon sun had settled into the lavender field behind the house. The color of the sky melted into the flowers almost seamlessly. I made tea and carried it outside, sitting on the old wooden bench my mother had built years ago. The wood was smooth from use, cool under my palms. On the table beside me sat the small digital recorder, the same one that had once carried so much weight. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The light that used to blink red when recording was dark, now silent. For a while, I just held it, listening to the hum of bees and the faint sound of wind brushing against the fence. The world no longer needed to hear the noise of proof. It already knew. I set the recorder down gently next to the tea. Across the garden, Clara's laughter drifted from the other side of the hedge as she spoke to a neighbor about paint colors. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, marking the hour. The moment felt suspended between memory and release. I leaned back and looked up at the pale sky, thinking of my mother, of how she always said every storm eventually clears, but you have to open the windows yourself. I smiled at the thought. The lavender swayed gently in the breeze. It looked like the field was breathing. I whispered softly, "Silence used to hurt. Now it heals." The sentence carried into the air, light and final. I stayed there until the sun dipped low, the colors of evening spilling slowly across the garden. When I finally went inside, I left the recorder on the table, its lights still off, and the air thick with the scent of lavender. The frame fades from black to the soft glow of the lavender garden behind me. The camera lingers for a second on the sunlight shifting through the leaves before it settles on my face. I look straight into the lens and start speaking, my voice calm but grounded. If you've ever been guilt-tripped into silence, this story is for you. The words hang for a moment, simple and sharp, before the faint sound of birds fills the background. I let a small pause breathe between each sentence. We're taught that love means giving even when it empties us. But real love has balance, not debt. I glance down at the table beside me where the recorder sits silent, its red light long gone. Would you have stayed quiet at that dinner? I ask, leaning forward slightly. The question feels direct but gentle, as if it's meant to pull the viewer into the memory rather than accuse them. The camera shifts closer. I continue. Maybe you've been there, the moment when someone you love crosses a line and still expects your forgiveness to clean it. That's the kind of silence that grows heavy in your chest. I smile faintly, the kind that carries a hint of ache, hit like if you've ever had to protect your peace from your own family. I say it softly, not as a demand, but as a bridge. It's not about the click. It's about recognition. Behind me, the lavender moves with the wind, a low hum of bees weaving through the stems. I glance over my shoulder, then back at the camera. The garden has healed, I say, because I stopped letting guilt water it. Another pause. The air is still. The faint clink of a teacup sounds as David sets one down out of frame. I pick it up, take a sip, and keep my eyes on the lens. Comment the moment you realize love isn't measured in guilt. Let people see they're not alone in drawing that line. The background light softens. I set the cup down beside the recorder. Once that little device held proof of betrayal, now it just holds space. My tone lowers almost to a whisper, because standing up for yourself isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The camera lingers on my face for a few seconds more, then pans slowly to the lavender field, the light fading into gold. The faint hum of summer fills the space where words used to live. Silence now feels like completion.